January 24, 1972. A thick, wet jungle on the island of Guam. Two local men are checking shrimp traps along a quiet stream, machetes in hand, mosquitoes thick in the humid air. It's a job they've done 100 times before. Nothing about this morning feels different. Then one of them freezes. Crouched in the reeds, half submerged in the muddy water, is a figure. Thin. Wild-haired. Skin the color of old leather, stretched over a frame that looks barely human. He is staring at them, and they are staring at him, and for a long, silent moment, nobody moves. Then the figure lunges. The two fishermen wrestle him to the ground, genuinely afraid for their lives. They have no idea who, or what, they've just caught. It will take hours before anyone understands the truth. They haven't stumbled onto an animal, or a hermit, or a madman. They've found a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army, a man who has been hiding in the jungles of Guam for 28 years, fighting a war that ended before some of their own parents were born. His name is Shoichi Yokoi. And his story is one of the strangest, saddest, and most extraordinary tales to come out of the Second World War. To understand how a man ends up hiding in a hole in the ground for almost 3 decades, you have to understand who he was before the war ever touched him. Shoichi Yokoi was born in 1915 in Aichi Prefecture, Japan. He wasn't a career military man, wasn't raised on stories of glory and conquest. He was a tailor's apprentice, a quiet, meticulous young man who spent his days cutting cloth and stitching kimono in a small shop. By all accounts, he was skilled at it. Precise. Patient. The kind of person who could sit still for hours doing careful, repetitive work. Those exact qualities, patience, precision, the ability to endure monotony without cracking, would one day save his life in ways he could never have imagined. In 1941, as Japan's war machine expanded across the Pacific, Yokoi was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He trained as a sergeant, eventually assigned to logistics and supply, practical work, suited to a man who'd spent his life measuring and cutting with exact hands. By 1943, he was shipped to the island of Guam. Guam was a strategically vital piece of real estate in the Pacific, a U.S. territory that Japan had seized in the panic and momentum of the war's early days. For the Japanese garrison stationed there, it was meant to be a fortress. An unsinkable island stronghold. It would not stay that way for long. In July 1944, American forces launched a massive invasion to retake Guam. What followed was brutal, grinding jungle warfare, flamethrowers clearing caves, naval bombardment flattening the coastline, tens of thousands of troops fighting for every ridge and valley. The Japanese garrison, roughly 18,000 strong, fought with the same doctrine that defined Imperial Japan's military culture at the time: surrender was not an option. Retreat was shameful. Death was preferable to capture. By early August, organized resistance had almost entirely collapsed. Of those 18,000 Japanese defenders, more than 98% were killed. Only a small fraction were captured. And a smaller fraction still, scattered, isolated, cut off from any command structure, did something else entirely. They vanished into the jungle. Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi was one of them. As American forces swept the island, Yokoi and a handful of other soldiers scattered into Guam's dense interior, a landscape of steep ravines, thick tropical canopy, and near-constant rainfall. Their orders, as they understood them, were unambiguous: Japanese soldiers were forbidden from surrendering. To be captured alive was a disgrace not just to yourself, but to your family, your ancestors, your entire nation. So they didn't surrender. They simply disappeared. For the first several years, Yokoi wasn't entirely alone. He moved and lived with small groups of other stragglers, men doing the same calculus he was, hiding, foraging, avoiding patrols. But the jungle wears people down. Some of the men Yokoi hid with were killed in chance encounters with American search patrols. Others succumbed to disease or starvation. And some, quietly, made the decision Yokoi refused to make: they surrendered. By the early 1960s, Yokoi was alone. And it's here that his story becomes something genuinely remarkable, not because of what he refused to do, but because of what he built. Using skills from his old life as a tailor, and a discipline that bordered on the superhuman, Yokoi constructed an underground shelter that would become his home for years, a narrow tunnel, dug by hand into the side of a ravine near the Talofafo River, reinforced with bamboo supports, camouflaged so completely that it was invisible from just a few feet away. The entrance was barely wide enough to crawl through. Inside, it was cramped, damp, and permanently dark, but it was safe. He engineered an ingenious life inside this hole. He wove his own clothing from the bark of wild hibiscus trees, spinning fiber into thread the same way he once handled silk and cotton in his tailor shop, patient, exact, methodical. He fashioned fish hooks and traps from scavenged metal and wire. He learned to catch eels, river shrimp, and frogs, and to identify which jungle plants were safe to eat. Rats became a staple protein. He built underground storage for food, using natural refrigeration from the cave's cool, damp earth to preserve what he caught. Every skill demanded total precision, because in that jungle, a mistake wasn't inconvenient, it was fatal. He knew, on some level, that the war might be over. Over the years, American aircraft dropped leaflets across Guam announcing Japan's surrender, urging any remaining holdouts to come out peacefully. Yokoi found some of these leaflets. He read them. And he didn't believe them. He had been trained to view any messaging from the enemy as psychological warfare, propaganda designed to lure Japanese soldiers into a trap, after which they'd be executed, or worse, become symbols of national humiliation. To surrender based on a leaflet dropped from an American plane wasn't just risky in his mind. It was exactly the kind of trick you'd expect from an enemy trying to finish the job of exterminating the last loyal defenders of the emperor. So he stayed hidden. Not for a year. Not for 5. For nearly 3 decades. He moved his shelter periodically, when he sensed locals getting too close, or after storms damaged his tunnels. He limited his movements to nighttime, when the risk of being spotted dropped dramatically. He learned the rhythms of the island's few human inhabitants so precisely that he could predict, almost to the hour, when it was safe to move and forage. Think about the sheer weight of that kind of existence. No conversation. No news. No family. No certainty, ever, that the danger had passed. Just the same narrow tunnel, the same routines, the same silence, for 28 years. By 1972, Yokoi was 56 years old. He had survived nearly 3 decades in hiding, longer than almost anyone else who'd taken the same desperate gamble in 1944. That January morning, 2 local Guamanian men, Jesus Dueñas and Manuel de Gracia, were checking shrimp traps along the Talofafo River when they spotted him. What happened next has been recounted slightly differently over the years, but the core of it remains the same. Startled and desperate, Yokoi tried to fight them off, genuinely believing his life was in danger. He was overpowered. And when the 2 men realized who, or rather, what, they'd found, the story exploded outward with astonishing speed. Within hours, it wasn't just local news. It was international news. A soldier of the Second World War, still fighting a war that had ended 27 years earlier, found alive in a hole in the ground on a U.S. territory in the middle of the Pacific. When authorities and reporters reached him, Yokoi was, by every account, in a state of complete disbelief and profound shame. He hadn't been captured in glorious battle. He'd been dragged out of the mud by 2 civilians with shrimp traps. For a man raised in a culture, and a military doctrine, that treated surrender as the ultimate dishonor, this wasn't liberation. It was humiliation. When Yokoi finally returned to Japan in February 1972, he was met not with judgment, but with overwhelming public fascination and, for many, genuine national pride. Japan in 1972 was a completely different country than the one Yokoi had left in 1943. It had been rebuilt from the ashes of total defeat into an economic powerhouse. A generation had grown up who'd never known the war firsthand. And here, suddenly, was a living relic of that vanished era, a man who had, in some strange way, never stopped fighting it. Crowds gathered. Cameras flashed. And Yokoi, stepping off the plane after 28 years underground, spoke the line that would define how history remembers him. It is with much embarrassment that I return. Not triumph. Not defiance. Embarrassment. It's a devastating thing to sit with, if you actually think about it. This was a man who had endured unimaginable hardship, who had built an entire survival system from nothing, who had outlasted starvation, disease, isolation, and despair for almost 30 years, and his first instinct upon rejoining the human race wasn't pride. It was shame that he hadn't died fighting. That single sentence tells you almost everything you need to know about the psychological world Yokoi had been trapped in, not just physically, in that jungle tunnel, but mentally, in a code of honor that had convinced him survival itself was a kind of failure. The Japanese public, though, didn't see him as a failure. They saw him as something closer to a symbol, proof of the discipline, endurance, and unbreakable loyalty that had once defined the wartime generation. He became a minor celebrity. He gave lectures. He wrote about his experiences. He eventually married, and settled into a quiet domestic life that stood in almost surreal contrast to the 28 years that preceded it. He also became a vocal advocate for simple living, frugality, and traditional values, a kind of unlikely cultural commentator, drawing directly on the discipline that had kept him alive in that cave. Yokoi lived until 1997, passing away at the age of 82, a full 25 years after his discovery, meaning he ultimately spent almost as much time back in civilian life as he had spent hiding from it. He never fully escaped the strange gravity of his own story. Interviewers kept coming back to the same questions. Did you really believe the war was still going on? Were you afraid? Do you regret it? His answers, over the years, painted a portrait of a man who was neither a fanatic nor a simple victim of propaganda, but something more human and more complicated, someone operating inside a belief system so total that questioning it wasn't really a choice available to him. He wasn't hiding because he was certain Japan was winning. He was hiding because the alternative, surrender, capture, disgrace, was, in his mind, simply unthinkable. It's worth placing Yokoi's story alongside the handful of other Japanese holdouts discovered in the decades after the war, men like Hio Onoda, found in the Philippines in 1974, 2 years after Yokoi, who required a direct order from his former commanding officer before he'd finally laid down his weapon. These weren't isolated freak occurrences. They were the extreme edge of a much larger phenomenon, thousands of Japanese soldiers scattered across the Pacific who took years, sometimes decades, to be found, to surrender, or simply to die still believing the war raged on. But Yokoi's case remains uniquely striking for one reason above all, the sheer, engineered ingenuity of his survival. Onoda, at least, had brief contact with other people and moved with a small unit for much of his ordeal. Yokoi spent his final years completely alone, sustained by nothing but his own hands, his tailor's precision, and a hand-dug tunnel that hid him from an entire modern civilization for nearly 3 decades. There's a version of this story that's simple. A soldier who wouldn't quit. A tale of loyalty and endurance, packaged neatly for a headline. But sit with the real details for a moment, and it gets a lot more complicated. This was a man who spent 28 years hiding from a war that had already ended, sacrificing companionship, comfort, even his own name in the wider world, in service of an order he was never given the chance to question. He wasn't rescued. He wasn't found by fellow soldiers in some final act of duty. He was pulled out of the mud by 2 men checking shrimp traps, and his first words to the world were an apology for having survived. So here's the question worth sitting with: was Shoichi Yokoi a symbol of extraordinary human resilience, or a tragic casualty of a belief system that valued death over the simple, human decision to come home? Maybe he was both. If you want to understand just how far that same unbreakable, almost incomprehensible sense of duty could stretch, look up the story of Hio Onoda next, a man found 2 years after Yokoi, on a different island, who held out even longer and who needed something far more extraordinary than a shrimp trap to finally bring him home.